In Revelation, the 2nd chapter, verses 12 through 17, it says the following. And to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, These things saith he which hath the sharp sword with two edges. I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. And thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days where Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwelleth. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. So hast thou also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will fight against thee with the sword of my mouth. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving he that receiveth it. See, the church at Pergamos had teachers that were leading some members astray with doctrines that encouraged idolatry and fornication. And you sort of almost have to understand that a lot of the members of the church had came out of pagan religions that had a lot of that type of thing in it. In fact, some of the pagan religions even had fornication as part of their worship, and even had prostitution in their temples. And some of these teachers were trying to keep some of those practices from the past. And they had false teachers that was working throughout the congregations at Pergamos. Now, the scriptures give many warnings about false teachers. In Jude, verses 3 and 4, it says, Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that you should earnestly contend for the faith, which was once delivered unto the saints. For there are certain men crept in unawares, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our God into lasciviousness, and denying the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, we must earnestly contend for the faith, and it's sometimes easy to allow teaching that is questionable to come in because, you know, we don't like to rock the boat. We don't like to confront people. We don't like to get in their face. And sometimes because we just don't want to create waves or that type of thing, we can let things go. And that's what happened at Pergamos. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 25, it says, But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. You know, in a sense, sometimes we can be asleep, if you will, to the dangers of false teaching. Because usually false teaching's subtle. And you almost have to be alert in order to see it. It's not always the most obvious thing. They don't come in and try to go the whole way all at once. They say one little thing, it sort of sounds maybe a little bit good, and you go with that, but then it gets to be a slippery slope. In Ephesians, the 4th chapter, in verse 14, it says, That we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. See, every wind of doctrine, I don't know, anyone that's been around the church for a while knows that there's new hobbies that come along every once in a while from different teachers. You'll hear that somebody has come up with a new twist on something. And you have to be careful that you don't get caught up in whatever the latest hobby is. I mean, I have heard people talking about people becoming more spiritually enlightened Remember back, I don't know how many years ago it's been, they used to talk about, well, we need a new hermeneutic. Remember that? Back when they said, we need a new way to study the Bible. Well, that was just people out there wanting to change, wanting to look good, wanting to be something new and exciting. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of." The sad fact of it is that there are some teachers out there that are pretty gifted speakers. And they can and do sometimes lead people astray. Satan places teachers into settings of believers and then uses their leavening influence to corrupt the church. What the devil ultimately wants to do is get the world and the churches hooked into worldliness, and that's what he did at Pergamus. Matthew Henry made a quote, and I think I'm going to write this down and maybe put it on my refrigerator. "The heart of man is narrow," he said, "and cannot contain both loves. The world draws down the heart from God, and so the more the love of the world prevails, the more the love of God dwindles and decays. The Spirit of God in true Christians is opposed to the spirit of the world." I like that one part. The more the love of the world prevails in you, the more the love of God is dwindling. When we start to love the world too much, it's just the way it is. Your love of God. Jesus himself says you cannot love God and mammon. You have to pick. And worldliness, the church at Pergamus had allowed worldliness to come into their midst. Now, when you think about worldliness, it usually comes, the Bible tells us, in three ways. There's the lust of the flesh. That's, always seeking out things that, the flesh likes, like pleasures, entertainments, addictions, just all kinds of things that people think will make them feel better. And maybe it even does for a little bit. But ultimately, there's a price tag with it. Larry had a sermon one time, probably about my favorite sermon he ever preached. He talked about glossy billboards. When you look at them from one side, they look really nice. And they paint a really nice picture, and they're shiny and that type thing. But if you go around the back, there's all kinds of cobwebs and dirt and everything else. And sin is often that way. The world portrays sin. It looks good. Looks like something you might want to do. But boy, once you get past the glossy front, you get into the cobwebs, and then it's bad, and you're hooked. And more than one person has faced life with addiction and all kinds of pain, because the price tag of sin is steep. And more than one person has learned that the hard way. Then there's the lust of the eyes, the intense desire to have something that we see. And it usually revolves around possessions or something like that. It's hard. Our culture teaches us to want things, and things can become idols to us faster than we think. Like, it's been a lot more years than I like to think about. I remember the first time, when I think I was about 18, 19 years old, I can't really remember, when I got my first car. And I was out there, that's back in the days when they had those magnesium wheels and all that stuff. I'd be out there polishing them. That thing was an idol to me. Back at that time, I wouldn't have understood that, but it was, because I was living for that car, you know? And that was a thing that was the lust of the eyes. I liked the way it looked, and I liked when other people looked at my car. Yeah? And then there's the pride of life. When we exaggerate or own value. You know, it's okay to have a healthy self-esteem. I'm not talking about that. You shouldn't think that you're bad either. But I think sometimes what happens to people is they can start to think too highly of themselves, as the Bible says. They want to have prominence. They want to have bigger and better roles than everybody else. And sort of a prideful desire to be the man or the woman, whatever. You know, and that too is wrong. Pergamus, there's some things I want to give you some information about it. It was the third church along the postal route in Asia Minor. And it was about halfway as you would go along from Ephesus, is where you'd start on the one sea coast. It was about halfway along to the 7 churches of Asia. Now, Ephesus had some good saints in it, but remember, the text says that they had lost their first love. Smyrna was a church that was desperately impoverished and in poverty, but they were rich in spiritual matters. But now Pergamus had given themselves over to worldliness. See, all these churches at that time had to deal with persecution. The Emperor Domitian at that time had decided that he wanted to attack the Christians in Asia Minor, because at that particular time, the church was strongest around Ephesus and in what's modern-day Turkey. That's where the church was strongest. And the Roman Emperor Domitian wanted to wipe out the church. And so there was a big persecution at that time. In fact, one of the roads that came out of Ephesus that led towards the shipping lanes that went to Rome was called the Road of the Martyrs, because so many Christians walked along it on their way to be taken to Rome. And in Smyrna, it caused them to have more devotion. Usually when there's pressure put on you, you know, either as a church or individually, it's going to do one of two things to you. It's either going to make you become closer to God, or it's going to cause you to become angry and drive you away. And so the different churches were reacting differently to the persecutions that they face. Now, Pergamus is what the modern-day city of Pergamum, and that's in the nation of Turkey. It's about 20 miles from the coast of the Aegean Sea, and it was about 100 miles north of Ephesus. Now, back in the day, Ephesus was this incredible city of many thousands of people. They're not exactly sure how many. But the Ephesus church, you know, had lost its first love. And the interesting thing is if you go there, there's a cruise ship port near where Ephesus was. But if you go there, Ephesus doesn't exist much anymore. There's some old ruins and everything. But the city that was Smyrna is now a bustling city. It has a different name. But it's amazing how those types of things go. Back in the day, people would have thought that Ephesus was always going to be the king, you know, the big one. But they left their first love. Now, Pergamus was known for its wealth and fashion, and it was the seat of the Roman government in the province of Asia. And that's probably what's meant when it talks about where Satan dwelleth, or Satan's seat. It's probably because it was the Roman government, you know, and the Emperor Domitian and that type of thing. It had a library of around 200,000 books. and was considered to be second only to the library that was in Alexandria, Egypt. And they were all hand copied by scribes on parchment. That's the parchment process. And back in the day, that's what a lot of the existing Bible manuscripts are still written on parchment that they have from the first few centuries. And it was this city here at Pergamus that sort of perfected that process. So we have them to thank at least for that. And it was a city that was given over to thinking highly of themselves as very educated, and they knew it all. You know what I mean? And that was perhaps part of their problem. The Bible tells us that the people that are poor in spirit, I think there's a reason it's the first beatitude. When you're poor in spirit, people can talk to you, they can teach you. But if you think you know it all already, what can I say to you? You know what I mean? So when we break down the verses in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 12, and to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, these things saith he which hath the sharp sword with two edges. Now, this is a fairly threatening introduction if you think about it. He says, I'm coming to you with the sword. And the sword is the Greek word rhomphia. Now, I'm going to spell it because I probably butchered it. It's R-H-O-M-P-H-I-A, rhomphia. And that was a large sword. It was about 3.5 feet long, and you had to grip it like a baseball bat, because it was heavy. And that's the sword that Jesus said he was coming to them with. And because they had got so far into worldliness that Christianity wasn't really pure anymore. You know, when you compromise Christianity too much, then there's this universalism that sort of comes in. And you've probably heard people say this. They get to the idea, well, everybody's going to heaven. You know, people out in the world sometimes get this idea, well, okay, maybe Hitler's going to hell and maybe, you know, people like that. But most people's going to heaven is what they'll tell you. And that's what happens when people start letting worldliness come in. It's just not true. Then he goes on to say in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 13, oh, by the way, what time do I shut down for when people come up? 10 after. Got it. Okay. I know thy works and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is, and holdest fast my name and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwelleth. And literally, the Greek word that's used here is dwelleth is katoi, K-A-T-O-I-K-E-I-N, whatever that is. And it means that that's where their permanent residence is. And literally, they lived right where Satan's seat was. You know, and one of the things that I think is interesting here is Jesus is telling them, look, I know where you live, and I know the situations you have to deal with. So he understands. The other thing he says is, I know your works. In fact, he says that to every one of the churches. I know your works. So today, Jesus knows the works of the church at Contend. He knows the works of the church at Somerville. He knows the works of Ben Wright. He knows the works of Mike Smith. He knows. Yeah, and it amazes me sometimes how people get this idea that they somehow can hide from God, that he doesn't know their works. You know? And you see it when people live double lives, that they look good here, but do they still look good on Friday night out there? It really doesn't matter. Jesus knows. And it never amazes me where sinful activities go on at like bars and stuff like that to keep the lights low. Maybe you can't see. You ever think of that? You know, it's like under cover of darkness is when people tend to do more sins. Do they think he can't see? It just amazes me how shallow people's thinking is. But he knows your works. He knows my works. And he also knows the circumstances that we have to live with. Charles Spurgeon made a comment that actually gives me comfort. It says, "Let it comfort you that your Lord knows all about it, and he can either remove you from the trying position, or else he can still more glorify his grace by supporting you in it and enabling you to overcome the enemy. He knows that Satan desires to have you, that he may sift you as wheat, and he prays for you that your faith fail not. He knows your perils, and he considers your trials. Right well, he perceives the way in which Satan would first mislead you and then accuse you. The subtlety of the old serpent he understands. He sees your struggles, your failures, and your desperate endeavors to hold fast to faith. He knows how at night you are grieved as you make your confession before him of your shortcomings. But he also knows the peculiar circumstances in which you are placed, and he judges you with great mercy." I really appreciate that comment because sometimes it's easy to think of God up there as with his finger near the zap button. You mess up, you know. But he loves you. And he knows what you're dealing with. He knows people that are mistreating you. He knows the pain you feel. He knows the betrayal that's happened at one point or another in your life. He knows. He knows the things that tempt you and the struggles you have. But he also knows how hard you're trying. The fact that you're here today, he knows that. When you could have stayed home, you didn't. He knows that too. And those are the things that matter. You know, it's said that during the reign of Diocletian, there were some Christian stonecutters in Pergamus that refused to carve an image of a Roman god into the stone, and they were killed because of their refusal to do so. You know, sometimes we live in a day when people think we should not have strong convictions about our religious beliefs. But, you know, there comes a time in life where you cannot move any further back. You can't compromise anymore. It does matter at some point what we believe. It does matter. The Lord then goes on to commend the faithful martyr Antipas, who was one of the leaders, and they think he was one of the elders at the church at Pergamos. And he took a strong stand against the idolatry that was there. And tradition says that he was roasted to death inside of a brass bull. What they did, what the Romans would do, is one of the things that they would do to scare the population. Crucifixion was one. You know, to keep control, they would try to terrorize the people, literally. And these brass bulls were another. They would make these bulls of brass and they would hollow them out. And they would put Christians inside them, the brass, and then build fires underneath. That's what they do. And then the brass would get real hot. But the other thing is because it was hollow, you know, whenever you're in a chamber or something and you yell, it echoes and everything. And literally, the screams of the dying people inside these things would make the bulls seem like they were making these big noises, you know. And they did it deliberately. And that's how they say that Antipas was killed. You know, people like that have paid with their lives for what they believed in. You know, can't we at least do some of the small things, you know, when you compare ourselves to them? It bothers me sometimes, and I'll just be honest with you. I get discouraged when I see a Sunday night crowd that's at a certain level, and then Wednesday night lower, and Sunday night lower yet. What else is more important than coming back? You know, but to them, you're right. But to them, evidently, it must be. Or it begs the question, why are you not here then? Do you see what I mean? At some point in time, and then you compare that against this guy that was willing to go to his death in that manner. I wouldn't want to be standing beside him in Judgment Day. Do you know what I mean? I really wouldn't. So this is, what I'm trying to say is, this is serious business that we're dealing with here. You know, we have to take it seriously, and unfortunately not everyone does. It goes on to talk here in Revelation chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. So hast thou also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. So now we come to the correction portion, where he talks about what the church at Pergamus needs to do. There were two prevailing doctrinal errors at Pergamus, and one was that sort of taught along the lines of idolatry and fornication, and reference Balaam from the Old Testament. What happened was some of the Greek Christians that came in wanted to keep some of their practices from their pagan religions that had to deal with immorality. And one of the big things that Paul had to deal with, not only here, but also in Corinth and other places, was eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, what Paul told the Corinthians is, look, the food itself isn't really the big deal, because what would happen is meat would get sacrificed to idols in these pagan religions, then some of it would find its way into the marketplace. And oftentimes Christians had no idea where that meat came from, and so they'd buy it. But some people, it came out of the religions, pagan religion, says, I'm not going to risk eating it because it would violate their conscience. Paul said, look, there's nothing really wrong with it, but if it bothers your conscience, he says, I'm not going to do it. And so there was a lot of controversy in the first century. But what it's talking about here is sometimes they would go back to some of those pagan places to get some of that food when they knew what was going on. And it would draw them back in sometimes to temple worship, including all the evil things, immorality that went with it. And so they're told not to company with these people. One of the things that you have to just keep in mind is sometimes you can't handle things. And what I mean by that is there are strong Christians that maybe can be around influence that aren't so good. There are others that can't. You know, if an alcoholic has no business being anywhere even close to where there's alcohol. Like a strong Christian maybe could go into a restaurant that has it, you know, and it wouldn't bother them at all. But someone that's been an alcoholic, they need to just keep their distance from all of it. You know, you have to understand and That's one of the things that the people at Pergamus needed to learn as well. There was also the doctrinal heresy that was at odds with holiness and righteousness. And the doctrine of Nicolaitans was very similar in practice. And they especially were into immorality. And it was more pagan traditions and that type of thing. And the thing that I find sort of frightening from all this is there were believers there at Pergamus that wasn't doing what the others were doing, but the Lord still had something against it because they tolerated it. See, if there's a lot of sin that I know about, and I let it go and just keep my mouth shut because I don't want to rock the boat, evidently that's not good either. That's not good either, because the church at Pergamus received condemnation, and the Lord was critical because it says, you have allowed this to go on, basically. When we see something that's wrong, we have to be willing to stand up and say it's wrong. And that's a hard thing to do. You know, I've had friends in a church, and part of what I do now is I'm supposed to counsel them. I'm supposed to be a spiritual guide to them. And I got to sometimes tell them, look, you can't be doing this. You can't do it. And it's not always comfortable, I'll be honest with you. There's times that I struggle with thinking, well, I can't be too harsh on them. And you got to go to them with love and everything. But on the other hand, you can't just let stuff go. Because if you do, it's not going to get better. And that's what Pergamus was doing. The church at Corinth even had that problem too. Remember when they had the man who had married, or not married, was living with his stepmother? And they were going around, look how tolerant and loving we are. But what did Paul tell them? He says, your glorying is not good. He says, know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? So we not only have to be careful about what we do, we have to be careful about what we're willing to tolerate. And that was the problem that the church at Pergamus ran into. And then finally he talks, and I see I'm just about out of time. He says, repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. This is a tough thing, but it's something that we have to say. A church begins to fail when it becomes a place where people are comfortable with their lifestyle of sin. The church cannot afford to be a place where unbelievers feel comfortable with never being converted as well. If someone is coming to church and they're living a lifestyle of sin, they should feel the pressure of that. The preachers and the teachers should be teaching and preaching in such a way, that people are being convicted. We have a saying, I guess it's common. I preached a lesson here 2 or 3 weeks ago where someone came in, they said, boy, you tramped on my toes today. And I says, that's good. I says, because that's exactly what we should be doing. We shouldn't, maybe on a given lesson or on some Sunday, maybe we can go out. But if we go week after week for several months and we leave without feeling the pressure to get better, then the teaching and preaching isn't hard enough. It's just the way it is. Because we should feel at one time or another that, we should feel we need to change. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop. Oh, I do?
Yeah, they're just warning you.
Oh, got it. Okay. Am I really doing someone a favor if I'm accepting of a sin in a brother or sister and I know about it? Am I really doing them a favor? And it's hard to deal with that, isn't it? You're right. You're doing them harm. But we don't think like that sometimes. But too many times I've seen things where over the years, where I had a feeling that things weren't so good. Sometimes I said stuff. Other times I didn't. And later on, I should have. There are people that I considered to be strong Christians that no longer attend. And you could see the warning signs of it, just slowly but surely, not quite as engaged, not coming as often, and just a slow, steady drift away. And you could see it. I didn't say anything to some of them. And today they're not there. I'm trying to do better at that. But it's challenging, especially with some of our young folks. We live in a society now where all the teaching is about tolerance. And you don't have the right to tell me how to live, you know. But that's not the way it is. It's not what the Bible message has been. If we see a brother or sister that's making mistakes, we're supposed to tell them. At least that's the way I understand it. You know? But some of our young folks are growing up with teaching in the schools that say, you can't tell somebody else that they're living wrong. It's not the way it's supposed to be, though. And we don't want to be a church, whether at Contend or Somerville or anywhere else, that's marked by worldliness or corruption in spiritual matters. We got to be better than that. And it's going to matter. And each one of us has to ask the question then too. Or is there any sin in our life that we're just flat out too comfortable with? You know, is there something we're doing that we've just got used to and maybe we're just not, we've just became too comfortable with it? Are we tolerating less in our spiritual walk than we should? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves. Do we know a brother or sister that needs confronted, but we're just afraid to rock the boat? Pergamus became a worldly church because they didn't confront things. We can't let that happen to us either at Contend or here at Somerville. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop then.